Welcome to episode 14 of the Froebel Trust podcast. I'm Colin Kelly, and in this episode we're focusing on the experiences of young children with additional needs in early years settings. Froebel, inventor of kindergarten, believed that all children are unique and develop at their own pace. At a time of year when many young children are joining settings and schools for the first time, this podcast explores how educators can support and welcome every child. How can educators today ensure that they're offering a truly inclusive environment which allows all children to play and learn? I'm joined by a panel of guests. Dr. Agnes Agyepong is a mother of three and the founder and CEO of the Global Black Maternal Health Institute, which produced the Black Child Send report earlier this year. This research report looked at the experiences of black and mixed black heritage primary school-aged children's access to SEND support in South London. I'm pleased to welcome back Janice Marriott. Janice is head of Tough Kid Nursery, a Jewish nursery school for mainstream children and those with disabilities and special educational needs. Janice leads the nursery with an integrated approach to learning through play. I'm also joined by Mawby Whistler. Eve is currently a nursery teacher in a primary school in Cambridgeshire. She gained her MA in Early Childhood Studies at the University of Roehampton, and it was there that she became inspired by a Froebelian approach to early education. She's now a Froebel Trust travelling tutor, sharing her Froebelian knowledge and supporting educators in schools and settings across the UK. Eve has co-authored a new Froebel Trust pamphlet published this month, all about supporting young children with additional needs. Well, Eve, if I could ask you first, we hear a lot about different terminology. I remember when I was at school, people talked about special needs, but I hear from your introductions the use of additional needs. What are the phrases that we should use when we're discussing this topic?
Yeah, well, that's quite a big topic and quite a big question. In the pamphlet on supporting children with additional needs, we use the term additional needs mainly because it is a widely used term and widely understood across the UK, but we are aware that across the UK and globally, different terms such as special needs, as you've mentioned, and additional learning needs are used. And I think the term has been useful as a shared term in helping us to describe children that learn differently or need specific adaptations or support to access learning. However, as Froebelian educators, we do wish to avoid labelling or categorising children, so we do acknowledge the limitations of the term additional needs. The most important thing is that each child is viewed holistically as a whole child within the broader picture of their family, their culture, and their profile of strengths, interests, likes and dislikes. So there is kind of a growing discontent with the term additional needs, and many educators and researchers do view it as quite outdated. So I think it's definitely something for us to be reflecting on and thinking about more.
And when you talk about additional needs, what does that encompass? Would that encompass a child with a disability, or would that be a separate terminology for them?
So in the pamphlet, we used additional needs as a very broad term to describe children with a range of different support needs. So that would include children with disabilities, with mobility needs, it could be visual or hearing impairment, and also children with neurodiversity as well.
Janice, if we think about your nursery at Tough Kids, I suppose the ideal, of course, when you're talking about children is that you're just using their name because you've got to know them, and we all have needs and challenges and situations that we're dealing with, but there might be times when you're having to talk about some of these topics, and it seems to me that the language is maybe sometimes a barrier.
Yes, I think so. I think that we always talk about looking at the child and where the child is at versus looking at the label. The label sometimes can be very limiting. And if we can see where a child is actually at, we had a child who came in who was 2.5 years old, however, was developmentally at a 9-month-old. So if we knew that, then we knew that she should benefit from a treasure basket, and we could celebrate that with her and the parents, versus us saying, well, this is her label, and therefore, we've got the resources which are out for the child of that age. So I think it's really important to look at each child as an individual and what stage they're at, and to celebrate that stage and to let them develop in that stage.
And Agnes, I know that you were leading a project looking at the experiences of young Black children with additional needs and their families in South London. There's some fascinating insight because you were speaking directly to these children and their families. What did your research find? What is the experience of young Black children with additional needs as opposed to the general population? Is there much of a difference?
Well, I'd say, first of all, the SEN system in general is broken at the moment. And I believe all children up and down the United Kingdom are not potentially getting the support that they need. I think that's the SEN system needs to be overhauled in general. Our work was not really about looking at this versus that in that kind of way. It was really about understanding the cultural lens that Black children or Black and mixed heritage children experience SEND. So, for example, we found so many different themes that came up in our report, looking at silos, looking at the kind of cultural nuances that are kind of interlinked when a family is trying to really understand the SEN system. I always like to give this example, if my heritage is Ghanaian and my children are half Ghanaian, half Tanzanian, and in those languages, there's not actually any word for mental health. There's not any word for SEN. So oftentimes educators might be trying to explain to a family that actually we think that your child has some sort of behavioural challenge or whatever it is, but they don't realise that when that family is translating that in their head, in their language, what you are basically saying is, we think your child is mad. And then that parent starts getting very defensive because obviously they want to defend their child, and there becomes a breakdown in communication for that child. So our report was about really getting to grips to understand what these nuances are. And that's because at the moment in the UK, Black 3 and 4-year-olds are 3 to 4 times more likely to be excluded from nursery.
You just mentioned there a breakdown in communication, and I just wanted to come back to this issue of the terminology we use and perhaps sometimes the lack of a shared language.
Yeah, I agree with that. There needs to be a shared language, but I think it's just that kind of cross-sector training, because actually what we found was that when the system was working well, or when parents said, actually, I had a really good experience, it was because of individual educators that were, or individual professionals, should I say, that were from all different backgrounds. You didn't have to be a Black professional that was supporting a Black family and then it was good. It's from all different backgrounds, but that one professional that came in and made that family feel seen and listened to, and actually said, I don't understand. Could you explain? When they didn't understand something, they didn't come in with any kind of preconceived ideas. That was when parents identified that they had a good experience, even if their child didn't get the outcome that they specifically wanted. So I do think language is really, really important. I also think when you don't know or you're not sure about something, it's okay to say that, or to say, you know what, actually, I'm going to go away and maybe speak to one of my colleagues and come back. It is language, but it's a lot bigger than that. I personally think.
Yeah. You mentioned there the professional that gets it right, that contributes to a positive experience. I wonder if I could start with Eve and then I'll go to Janice. What can we do to make sure that every child has that good experience, maybe right from the beginning? And I'm conscious that there might be children right now having their first experience of some sort of education setting. So what do we do to make sure that it's welcoming and positive for everyone?
I think it's really important that we build up a relationship that is characterized by trust and respect with the parent or carer or family right from the beginning, even before the child starts the setting. It's really vital that the parents and the carers feel that the setting is an inclusive community and that their child is really welcomed into that community. And I think there's many ways that we can support parents and families to feel really included and welcomed. And I think that first point of contact is really crucial. So it could be the home visit, when the educator first visits the child at home and visits the parent and carer, or it could be the child's first visit to the setting or the parent or carer's first visit to the setting. It's really important that we start building the relationship from that point. This is where having a key person really comes in. It's having that one person that the family feels connected to and can trust and can build up that relationship with. And so it's important to consider as a team who the appropriate key person is for that family. There might be a particular educator that is a good fit for that family. Perhaps they share some characteristics or experiences with that family. The family feels more comfortable with them. So it's important to reflect on that as a team. It's also really important that when we start having those discussions with parents and carers about their children, that the parent and carer feels that they can lead that conversation, and that we start with open-ended questions about the child's interests, the things they like and the things they dislike, about how they communicate their feelings, how they communicate their needs, so that we can get that holistic picture of the child. And I think at that point, the parent can communicate if they have any concerns about the child's development, or if they have had any contact with other agencies or professionals, and in a way that they feel comfortable and in a way that they're in control of.
Yeah. And Janice, at Tough Kids, how would these initial conversations take place in terms of, you finding out about the child, finding out about the situation, and any additional needs that we might have to discuss? How's that introduced?
So we do a home visit as well. And what we would do at the home visit, again, is gather as much information as we can. One of the key things we also do at the home visit is we really focus in also with the parent on what songs they sing with their child as well. And we're doing that so that when the child comes in, those are, Froebel talks about mother songs, which was about how the mother had that attachment to the baby as well, singing, the baby would coo and she would sing back. We find that often our parents have got these songs which they sing, and those are today's mother songs. So when our children come into the nursery and they settling in, we can sing those songs when the parent leaves, because often the parent will go for about 10 minutes, and we've got those songs that child, we see them visibly relax, that we know, and we've got what supports them. We also have meetings. So often our children would have local authority involved. So before we would do a big meeting, we have professionals in the nursery. So in our nursery, we have a physiotherapist, an occupational therapist, a dance movement therapist, and a speech and language therapist. And we would do a team around the child meeting to make sure that we've all got as much information as we can. Bearing in mind, though, that often children are very different from how they present at home. So we know when they come into the nursery, they might be doing a lot more at home, or they're doing things differently in the nursery from how home is. And it's very important for us to help the parent to relax about that. It's a different environment. It's an education environment that's very busy. There's lots more children. And we also want to try and make sure, when we can, is if a child needs to have objects of reference to help support them, that's an object rather than something visual, because some children aren't using visuals yet. So we want to try and make sure that we've got as many things in place, including Makaton, which is signing for all the children. But that we do with absolutely everybody, which really supports our mainstream children in also communicating with our children with additional needs as well. We say to parents, they can stay as long as they want. We've had parents who stayed with us 6 weeks. We've had parents who've only stayed with us 5 minutes. But it's about helping support them if their child is ready. So I happen to have this year just started now a parent who came in. She says, last time I started with my other child, I was with you for 6 weeks. This time she's managed 2 days and she's left. But that's what the child needed. And we are saying to the parent, look, we will help you, support you, whatever you need and the child needs. So it's about building that trust, which is going to carry them through life. So we need the parent to trust us and the child to trust us as well.
I'm just picking up on one thing Agnes said. She spoke about the system being broken, and broken for pretty much everyone. And there's comments from the Secretary of State for Education in England, Bridget Phillipson, who wrote to educators and leaders and said what probably many of you have felt for a while, that because of severe financial constraints and growing problems with the right support, the persistence of these problems leads to an erosion of hope. So, Agnes, is it broken just because of funding and budgets, or is there more going on? And how do you think we can start fixing it?
I think it's a mixture of everything you just said there. Funding, teachers need to be adequately paid. I think educators are the most important people. And I say this as a mother of three and somebody who I would say survived COVID having three children at home. And when they could go back to school and nursery, I literally wanted to hug my teachers. Obviously, we couldn't because of social distancing, but it really puts into perspective the role of educators and how valuable you all are. So I think number one, our teachers need to be fairly compensated for the work that they do. I think number two, leading on from that point, is that SEND or SENCO or additional needs, that should not just necessarily be a department. That needs to be something that is interweaved throughout the whole educational system. Every single teacher should be, and I say this in inverted commas, a SEND teacher, right? They should all have an understanding. One of my children in their school, I went there the other day and I noticed that instead of having two TAs, they now only have one, and that one goes in between two of the classrooms. And, as I said, I'm a mum of three, and, at home, I find that a lot. And I'm thinking, hold on a minute, you've now got, 60 children in a room, one TA that's going back and forth. And this is my son is 5. When you think about then the strain of a teacher trying to do the best that they can do, but also support other children in their class who have got other additional needs, you can understand where those challenges are coming from. So teachers need to be fairly compensated, but we also need to make sure that we have enough staff inside our classrooms to be able to give that quality care. Otherwise, you're going to have all these wonderful speeches and reports coming out saying we need to do X and we need to do Y and we need to do Z, but there's no capacity for schools and teachers to be able to actually deliver on what the government is saying.
Well, let's just bring Janice in now, because
Thanks.
Janice, you're in there every day. Do you feel that you have the support you need?
So we have our key worker who is going to be that initial attachment for the child, which is, part of attachment theory. And then what happens very quickly, all the other educators will start working with that child as well, so that everybody knows how to work with every child in the nursery. And it means that if a teacher isn't there one day, that it doesn't make a difference to that child's package of care. They can still come in, they're still going to get everything they need and be able to access everything, versus in other places, which again, when you only have one person who is working with one child, if that person isn't there, that educator isn't there, then it's going to be difficult for that child. The parents have to fight very, very hard. These parents already have so much that they have to deal with on a daily basis with their children. And in order to access any sort of funding, the fight is to another level. It's so difficult for them. And I always have to say to them, it's not about your child even half the time. It's just the system. This is the system.
Agnes.
One of the biggest challenges is that actually Black children, and we can particularly say Black boys, but Black children in general, they are over-identified as actually having SEND, but they're under-supported. And it kind of touches on the points that Janice was saying. It's just a fight. It is a huge fight to be able to get this support. And if you then add kind of race and economics into it, who are some of the families that can fight, and who are some of the families that may be disproportionately disempowered to be able to fight this system that even I've spoken to educators with PhDs and so forth, and they are struggling to go through the system for their children. So it is important that there is an over-identification, but it's that under support, and we believe it's because of the different systemic challenges to fight that all families are experiencing. But then, as you know how equity works, those that are kind of usually worse off then find it even harder to fight the different systems.
Well, one of the other things we're hearing, Janice, and I think Agnes picked up in a report, is different professionals not always speaking to each other, even sometimes when they're in the same building. And I wondered, is that a frustration that you've encountered as well?
So yes, we definitely have found that there is a split between education and health. And because we've got this split between them, health will say, we're not providing the chair for that particular child. It's education. That child needs a special chair in the nursery that they can't eat, otherwise they're going to aspirate. So we have to have a chair to feed them. But education says that's not us, that's health. So that's occupational therapy who comes under health. So they sort of bat it back at each other unless we put our foot down and say that child can't come in. And that's terrible for the parent that we would have to say something like that. So we need them to take responsibility. We try and get all this in place before the children come into the nursery, but it's not working.
And of course, there's so much emotion involved in all of this, isn't there, for parents and carers? And their own mental health is important. Their own well-being is important as well. Eve, I know that you've recently co-authored this new Froebel Trust pamphlet, and it's all about supporting young children with additional needs. What's in there that might help educators who are dealing with the topics we're discussing today?
The pamphlet is aimed at educators, but it's also a useful resource for parents, carers, anybody working with children or interested in working with children. And the pamphlet details how to support children with additional needs. It covers key features of Froebelian practice, such as the importance of play and having long, uninterrupted stretches of play and ensuring that all children have this. There can be a tendency for children with additional needs to have their play interrupted by interventions and for them to have a timetable that's quite filled up in comparison to typically developing children. So this pamphlet is really about how we can ensure that we can support children using the Froebelian principles and adapt our practice and environment to ensure that we're meeting the needs of all children. Coming from a Froebelian perspective, we have a respect for the child's developmental stage and where they're at. And one of the key Froebelian principles is starting where the learner is at, letting the child be the stage they are at and not focusing constantly on pushing them to reach the next stage. It's also about respecting that children have lots of different ways of communicating. And also we avoid taking a deficit approach, which is focusing on delays and deficits or having an assumption that all children should play a certain way or should communicate a certain way. A Froebelian approach is all about respecting diversity, respecting that all children are different, all children communicate in different ways.
Yeah, absolutely, Eve. I'm just keen to get Janice's perspective on that as well.
I think that's really important that children with additional needs are allowed to take risks, like mainstream children are allowed to take risks as well. Obviously, risks at their level. So when we're doing cooking with support, they can use the potato peelers as well, or use the hammers and the saws for the woodwork. And I think that we shouldn't be limiting them. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Janice. I think taking risks is absolutely integral to a Froebelian approach and to our development. I think there's often an anxiety around physical risk, for example, using tools, and like Janice was saying, hammers and saws and things like that. And this can be kind of increased when working with children with additional needs. Occasionally, you can come across children who don't have much risk awareness or awareness of danger, who do need a little bit more support. But this shouldn't, like Janice is saying, this shouldn't mean that we prevent them from taking risks and we sort of exclude them from any of the Froebelian occupations such as woodwork or cooking. I think, again, it depends on the child, but we do mention in the pamphlet some sort of strategies that you can use to support children with additional needs to take risks. And some of the things that we've suggested are thinking about having that one-to-one support, making sure that the adult is thinking about, again, how they balance the freedom with guidance. Maybe they need to give a little more guidance. It's also about thinking about the ratios, maybe thinking about how many children take part in the cooking if you're using a knife or something like that, or thinking about how many children there are at the woodwork bench, and making that ratio higher if needed. But yeah, it is really, really important that we support children to explore risk safely in a way that is appropriate for them.
Well, thinking about the support and guidance individual children may need, what about this question of labelling children and understanding children's behaviour, Eve?
In my experience, when we're dealing with what we might perceive as challenging behaviour in very young children, the first thing that we should do is have a look at our routines, have a look at our expectations, and it tends to be that when we're meeting children's needs, when what we're offering is appropriate to the child's level of development, that we can solve a lot of those behavioural issues that we might struggle with. So are we expecting children to sit for too long on the carpet? Do children have enough time to play? Are there enough opportunities for physical play? Are children moving enough? Children are not designed to sit on the carpet for long stretches of time. Children need to be challenged physically, they need to be challenged mentally. And I've seen the really powerful impact that the Froebelian occupations like woodwork and cooking have on children who have been perceived as having challenging behavior. So being given responsibility, being trusted with kind of dangerous tools, children that educators might think cannot listen to instructions will suddenly be listening to the instructions and following it because they have that intrinsic motivation to do so.
Agnes, can I bring you in here?
What I would say is that we need to really be checking our own selves and our own biases, and we all have them. I have biases, you have biases, we all have biases. My grandma had biases, everybody has biases. But when we're looking at how, when we're kind of assessing children's behaviour, really, really, really checking out ourselves to ensure that is it actually a behavioural challenge problem in the way that we've perceived it to be, or is there a little bit more investigation that we need to do there? I think I would really kind of implore every educator, irrespective of your background, to really do so, because those stats need to come down. We're in 2024, and we can't have it that our most vulnerable children, age 3 to 4, to me, are very vulnerable, are more likely to be excluded for nothing but their race. You may have heard of Oasis, and they have a farm in Waterloo, and that farm is often used by schools, particularly schools who have children who are perceived to have challenging behaviour. And it's so interesting when they go to this farming, their whole behaviour changes, and they're regulated, and they're listening to instructions. And these are children who are near exclusion. These are children who are being perceived as very unruly, and they're not listening in lessons and so forth. So again, it just shows that when children are in different environments, how they can thrive.
Yeah, can I just also bring in about we found children with emotional behavioral issues, and they have thrived with looking after. We have a hamster, as well as being outside and watering the plants and picking the tomatoes. Once a week, we have a therapy dog that comes in, that is a trained therapy dog, which again helps support those children with their behavior. And it's phenomenal how living beings, living things, and if you can show a child something living that they can take care of, they will start taking care of themselves and others eventually. But to start off with something living like an animal and a plant is hugely valuable for them.
Eve, I've been reading a lot about transitions and I think interruptions sometimes across the day. And I remember a child who was taken out of a class or out of a setting in order to go for speech therapy, for example. Is it better these days if as much time as possible everybody's spent together in the main room, or is it unavoidable that sometimes to get that specialist support, people will have to leave the main room for a period?
I think one of the key things about the Froebelian approach is that importance of long stretches of uninterrupted play for all children. And I think avoiding interruptions is very, very important. I think, as I mentioned, that there can be a tendency to split the session up for children with additional needs. And often when you are getting advice from multi-agency outside professionals, such as speech and language therapists or educational psychologists, they may suggest interventions that don't fit with a Froebelian approach. So I do think the content of the intervention is obviously very key. And there are some interventions that, for example, a child with autism to mimic sort of neurotypical skills, which just encourages them to mask their ways of communicating and probably wouldn't fit with the Froebelian approach. So as much as possible, I think it is important to avoid interruptions and to design the session or organize the session in a way that if there are times when a child has to leave the main provision, and there might be times when that's appropriate, such as if the child's becoming kind of overstimulated in the main environment. I know there are Froebelian settings where they do have separate spaces where children with additional needs can go if they've become overwhelmed or they need a quieter space. So obviously it depends, like as with everything with a Froebelian approach, it depends on the individual child. But I would say, as a general rule, avoiding interruptions is important. And if there are times when interventions, if they are appropriate, need to happen, it's probably important to timetable them at the beginning or end of the session so that time for play can be really maximized, because that is a priority in the Froebelian approach.
And Janice, I know you wanted to come in on that as well.
I just want to add to that. So another Froebelian approach is freedom with guidance. And that is where you've got adults who have a knowledge on how to help support a child and scaffold their learning and really help them to develop it. And the way that therapists work in our nursery is that they don't do any pull-out. They work in the main room. They work outside. We have free flow, so the children can be outside whenever they want. So the physiotherapists might be outside in the garden, so might be the occupational therapist, even the speech and language therapist, who also might be in the home corner or might be at snack table, using the environment and to not have to take the child and interrupt their play, but to support the child in their play.
I wanted to ask as well, Janice, my instinct sometimes is to avoid talking about the differences that we might have. So, for example, someone from a different race or a different background, someone in a chair. Is it okay to mention those things? Do the educators talk about them? Does it to sort of normalize it, or is it better not to sort of point these things out?
So we celebrate, and we celebrate everybody's differences. We've got children who wear glasses. We've got children who have hearing aids. We have children who have very, very special chairs. And what we find is that our mainstream children actually will be the ones to go and run to get that particular chair for that child, because they know that's the best way to support that child. And it's because we've celebrated it. It's okay to have these differences. We're all different. And I think that if we can use that and celebrate it, it's going to make all our children into much more sensitive people.
I was just going to add that another benefit of having all of the children together in the provision and not constantly taking out children with additional needs for interventions and removing them from the setting is ensuring that it supports all of the children to understand, like Janice was saying, that we all have differences, and respecting those differences, and also understanding that other people might need different things to us. So, for example, when I worked in the maintained nursery, when we had our lunch times and snack times together, there were children that needed adaptations. They might have needed a different food, a different seat. They might have needed to go into the lunchroom earlier than the other children. There was educators that were anxious, and sometimes people can be anxious that if you're not giving every child the exact same thing, that the other children will feel it's unfair. And actually what I experienced was the total opposite, was that when you talk to children openly about this and they understand that this child needs a different food because he has difficulty swallowing, they can be so understanding and completely accepting of their friend or their peer might need something different to them, and they won't see it as unfair.
It's amazing if we just sit back and take the lead from children. They show us, don't they? Agnes, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Janice and Eve have said. I personally find it quite awkward or offensive when someone says, "Oh, I don't see race." Well, I can see my race, and so of course you can see me, and I can see you've got blonde hair, and I can see you've got brown hair. The issue isn't the seeing of the race; it's the fact: am I being celebrated or am I not? And I think that's the same as if a child's got an additional need, or they've got a different faith. The issue isn't about pinpointing. I don't think anybody would pinpoint if a child comes up and says, "Oh, you've got blonde hair," or "Oh my goodness, you've got brown skin." I'm not going to be like, "Oh, why?" Because I can see that I have that, and most people will say, "Yes, we can recognize that." And the problem is the labeling. Is that labeling done in a way that can be detrimental to that child or to that family? Or is it done in a way that can empower the family? Because now you've got, there's different information. Janice has spoken a lot about her nursery, and the Judaism faith there. So I would want to know that, so that I'm not, I'm making sure I'm respecting the Sabbath and I'm respecting how I'm communicating with her and the children. If I don't have that information and I'm like, well, I can't see that, then how can I make sure that I'm being respectful to Janice in the way that she would need me to be respectful? So I think it is just echoing that point about you can highlight people's differences. I think that's really, really important, because we're not made to all be the same. What a boring world would that be if we were all the same? And I think, from a very young age, being able to celebrate children's differences, all we're doing is creating a world where everybody has respect for one another.
And what would your advice be, Janice, to educators and early years leaders if they're listening to this and they think, oh, I think we could do better. We've talked about celebrating every individual child. We could do better at that welcoming environment and celebrating them. What do you think they should do next?
Definitely get in contact with the Froebel Trust. We started the process 7 years ago, and we were already working in a Froebelian way without realizing it. And I think most educators they'll embrace this. They'll go, oh yes, that's how we were working. But what it's giving you is it's actually giving you the permissions to spend time observing the children, to give the children the time to really, without interrupting them, to play, to have freedom with guidance. The children thrive. And as I said, as educators, we've spent so much time knowing that we had to do so much paperwork. This gives you the permission to say, step back.
Eve, the Froebel Trust pamphlet that you've co-authored, that we've referred to throughout this podcast, what are you hoping that achieves?
I think we're hoping that more educators, not just in the early years, but in primary years and beyond, will become interested in how we can use a Froebelian approach to support children with additional needs. And I hope that it will contribute to challenging the deficit narrative around children with additional needs. Within a Froebelian approach, we talk a lot, and I know Janice has mentioned it many times, about freedom with guidance. So a Froebelian approach is not just about giving children complete freedom. It's not about a laissez-faire approach to education and just leaving children to it. Froebel understood that children are biologically predisposed to learn and develop, and that there is a natural course of development that children follow biologically, but also that they need the appropriate environment and the appropriate support from the adults around them in order to meet their potential. But what that potential is will look different for every child. So providing freedom with guidance is all about balancing giving children autonomy and freedom with providing the appropriate guidance and support. But the ultimate goal is for children to reach their potential and to become autonomous, independent learners.
So just to draw this discussion to a close, those comments from the Secretary of State for Education, and she mentioned the erosion of hope. Are we able to end this podcast on a hopeful note? Even in these challenging times, Janice, is there hope?
Yes, no, I definitely think there is hope. I think that, if we are using the Froebelian approach and we are allowing children to take risks and to explore with their senses, and that we really look at each child for who they are, and they can be at the stage that they are at, and we celebrate that.
Agnes, do you agree?
Yeah, I do think there is hope. I think the fact that we're all identifying and being able to name the problem, and that is that the system, is broken, full stop. That's a starting point. It means that we can build back. And I suppose on my side, I want to make sure that we're building back better. We're building a system that looks different, that is relevant for today and tomorrow's children. Even just being on this podcast now, like, look at how passionate we all are. And I've spoken to so many different educators and people that are working with children, and it's the same, on the ground. Educators and professionals want to do good. It's just at the moment where so many of us are in silos and we're not able to have that kind of joined up approach. And I think now that we're all being able to name the problem and we've got consensus, not just from the client facing view of the educators that are dealing with children, but actually from the government perspective, it means that now our conversations are not just focused on naming the problem and saying this is all bad and this is all bad. It's now focused on, okay, we understand these are the challenges, but how can we work together? And I think it's a really exciting time that we can now start looking forward about how we can build back better.
Well, that note of optimism from Agnes Agyepong brings us to the end of this episode of the Froebel Trust podcast. You can find out more about how a Froebelian approach to early years education can help all children by accessing the resources we've linked to in the podcast description. You can also find out more about all the guests that you've heard from in this episode. Dr. Agnes Agyepong, founder and CEO of the Global Black Maternal Health Institute. Mawby Whistler, a nursery teacher in Cambridgeshire and Froebel Trust travelling tutor. And Janice Marriott, head of Tough Kid Nursery in London. Special thanks again to all my guests. Remember, there's a full transcript for this episode, as well as all the previous episodes of the Froebel Trust podcast, as well as details of training and additional resources. It's all on the Froebel Trust website at froebel.org.uk. That's froebel.org.uk. Thank you very much for listening. Subscribe or follow this podcast, and you'll receive all our episodes as soon as they're published.